Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Tom Keene, along with Paul Sweeney. Join us each day for insight from the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app. Scarlet Fu, the New York Post, no fan of President Biden, let's be sure now, but this is all over the media. I didn't know this. The president speaks at a Georgia Waffle House following the debate performance, quote, "I think we did well." Could you see Libby Cantrill at a Waffle House? I just can't. I can't. In the music business, we used to call it Chez Waff. Because, you're driving down to Nashville and it's the only thing open at 3 a.m.
During a road trip, maybe.
Have you ever been to a Waffle House?
I have not gone to a Waffle House.
It makes Cracker Barrel look like, Danielle up on 65th. You've never been to a Waffle House.
No, I haven't.
Joining us now, the queen of the Waffle House, Libby Cantrill, joins us from PIMCO. Libby, have you ever darkened the door of a Waffle House?
I love a waffle. I love a 12, a midnight waffle.
Exactly. You can only go at midnight.
Egg and cheese. Come on.
Oh.
I feel like, he knows
and
his constituents.
And that's synthetic butter. It's just
gotta love
too
it.
much. Libby, thank you so much for joining us after the history made last night. I got 8 ways to go here, but let's stay with your public policy, which means the legislative branch. How does Capitol Hill react to what we witnessed last night?
Yeah, there is definitely the reports of a collective freak out, to use a more technical term, the collective bedwetting, are correct. I think folks who are on the ballot, particularly those who are in vulnerable Senate races, who are in House races that, of course, Democrats control the Senate by 1 vote. How the Democrats are hoping to flip the House. Republicans controlled by a very small margin. I think those folks are very concerned this morning. Now, interestingly, as you know,
right,
they've been actually outperforming on polls. So there has been a big gap between those candidates and Biden.
Yeah.
But I think they are very concerned that Biden will be a headwind to both re-election and to their aspirations of flipping the House.
In your world, you're surrounded by people that won't shut up. I don't know if you know this, but they have this surveillance cork where it's Tucker or, Scarlett can put in my mouth, Tom, shut up. In your world, nobody stops talking. Was President Trump advantaged last night because he didn't have a mic on a lot, so he had to stop talking?
I think the format absolutely favored President Trump. I think sort of ironically, the Biden world thought that not having an audience, being able to mute the mics would be a detriment to President Trump. But if anything, he seemed more controlled, more moderated. Now, how both candidates characterize each other's presidencies were just not correct. There were a lot of falsehoods, I think, honestly, on both sides. But the reality is that President Biden did not fact check President Trump. Mm-hmm. And of course, the broader issue here is that he just underscored all of the concerns about his age. And President Trump, on the other hand, looked energetic. He was confident, and he was very much on his talking points. He talked a lot about immigration. He talked a lot about inflation. I think from a market's perspective, we didn't hear anything about deficit restraint. I think if anything, both gentlemen really reinforced the importance of Medicare and Social Security. There was no really whiff of reform. President Biden talked a little bit about it. And they talked about tariffs. And so I think the big themes for the markets, higher deficits, and more tariffs, more hawkishness on China. Those are, I think, if you're trading in front of your screen this morning, those are kind of the big takeaways.
John does that. Here at Bloomberg Surveillance, Tucker's doing, meme stocks here. He's trading.
but those I think are the big takeaways. Obviously, the chances of President Trump being reelected are higher this morning than they were yesterday.
I think after yesterday's debate, it's clear that style over substance was the big takeaway from the proceedings of 90 minutes. I guess the question now is, how does the White House regain control of the narrative versus how do Democrats as a party regain control of the narrative?
Yeah, well, I think there is no really indication from Biden world, at least the campaign world, that there is a problem. I do think that, it sounds like from what folks are saying, that internally in the White House there are concerns. I think, Scarlett, though, the broader question is, even though folks are talking about an open convention or replacing President Biden, the only person who can make that decision is Biden himself. We are not in the 1960s, right? This is not 1960. This is not 1968, where you had party elders in the back room smoking cigars.
This is not LBJ after the TED events.
No, and we keep reinforcing that to clients, is that the party mechanics are so different from those days. And so really only President Biden can make the decision on whether he is going to continue to be on the ticket. And this is his decision alone. With
PIMCO, and particularly with the Allianz on the continent of Europe, you've always had an international feel. Foreign Affairs, and I give Foreign Affairs great credit. They had 2 Biden-Trump foreign analysis within the latest issue. And the Democratic side, of course, was done by Ben Rhodes. Who else? Ben Rhodes last night on Twitter. Just think about what that debate looked like to people and leaders around the world. Libby, how, you mentioned this earlier, Scarlett, how will this be taken particularly by Beijing? Nick Burns has to deal with Beijing over there.
Yeah, and I actually, by the way, that Foreign Affairs article, Ben Rhodes' article, is very interesting. Robert O'Brien's article in that latest issue, I would say, if you're interested in what a Trump 2.0 foreign policy will look like, that is worth a read, because he sort of lays out the roadmap for foreign policy. This, of course, President Biden is not only a candidate, he is the president of the United States. And so I think what signal did he send both our allies, but also to China? Well, he did not, of course, restore any confidence that he can manage 4 more years, let alone next 90 minutes. So I think it really undermined. I think I don't want to be hyperbolic here. We don't want to sort of over extrapolate from one debate. Right. But again, it reinforced.
Okay, cut to the chase. What do you tell Jerome Schneider today? He's in short-term paper. What's the market effect for Jerome Schneider at PIMCO that you see in Washington?
Well, again, I think that the big takeaway from last night is that deficits are going to continue to go up because neither candidate is going to reform the entitlements. They may not be able to spend a lot more, but they're not going to do anything about our structural deficit issue. And again, tariffs are likely to go up. I thought the interesting conversation around tariffs was that President Trump was not defensive of his tariff plan. He was leaning into it. He was talking about how it wasn't going to increase inflation, how it was a good thing for the United States, both from a national security perspective and an economic perspective. He talked about deficit reduction in terms of tariffs. So I think the big takeaway, Tom, is, and this is true if Biden is elected too, deficits are going up, and likely we're going to have more hawkish, relationship with China, and tariffs are going up.
Libby, thank you. Libby Cantrill with Public Policy and PIMCO here after this historic debate. The first smart note last evening was from Terry Haines. He's with Pangaea Policy. He's been doing this forever. He was prepared. But the bottom line is Terry Haines absolutely nailed it last night with perspective over what we saw. Scarlett Fu and Tom Keene now with Terry Haines. Terry, I'm not going to mince words off your note. I'm going to pick a couple ideas here as I can. Others, the Democrats particularly, are like nervous for next week until the polling consequences fully shake out. How low will the polling be? How will they adjust after President Biden's performance?
Well, I don't think the polling is going to change a great deal over the next 10 days. That is instinct on my part. But compare this. Biden at 3 points. Biden is at roughly 42% right now. He and Trump are tied. 33% of those surveyed in the CNN Flash post-debate poll thought Biden won the debate. And, there's a bunch of different snark we could respond to. But but there's a third of those, not too far off the 42% thought that he won. So I think what you're probably going to get is some sort of a dip. But, short attention span theater here is going to move on to Trump immunity, Trump sentencing, conventions, all kinds of other things. Meanwhile, Biden's got a lot of time to try to correct the ship, and Democrats have nowhere to go on this, frankly.
Okay, well, that's a really important distinction now. The zeitgeist this morning is they do have a place to go. Why can't they go to a president who decides with his family to, in some form, not run for a second term? And there's 7 or 8 other people that can make this look like Grover Cleveland Alexander in 1880. Why can't they do that?
That was Grover Cleveland, not Grover Cleveland Alexander.
Excuse me. Sorry.
Anyway, but the point is really twofold. One is that Biden's got a tight grip on the party. Secondly, a lot of the party's been enabling, and pockets of the media as well. Not this network, but pockets of the media have been enabling Democrats, particularly corporate Democrats in Washington, trying to ignore this as best they can. Now the reckoning is here. The last thing I think they will do is make a snap decision to jettison the sitting president off the ticket, and the sitting president will resist that with every fiber in his being. He's been after this for 50 years. Reality will set in, and the plan B will be, how do we prop this up and move forward?
Mm-hmm. Let me bring in Scarlett Fu in for Paul Sweeney this morning. Scarlett?
Terry, we know a lot of Americans don't like the candidates running for president in November, and they want someone else. Does the debate boost any third-party candidates?
I don't think it does, Scarlett. There's a huge disparity in a lot of things related to this election. One is the appetite for a third-party candidate compared with the actual third-party candidates. I thought at one point, probably back in January or so, February, that Bob Kennedy had a pretty decent shot at becoming a serious candidate. He's decided to turn himself into a niche candidate, and his numbers reflect that. The air is slowly being let out of the balloon and will continue to, I think, continue in that direction. The other thing I want to point out to you, it's implied in your question, is, where do people go? If this was any other Republican other than Trump, you'd see wholesale flight from Biden to that Republican candidate, I think. Polling continues to show, though, that even though people are kind of marginal on Biden, they don't want to go to Trump. There's no such thing as a somewhat disapproves of Trump. It's all strong disapproval. So, these people are in a bit of a quandary, which, in a backhanded way, works in Biden's favor, I think.
Okay, so that's how it stands with voters. What about our allies, our rivals in the global theater? As Democrats wait for polls to come out, and you said it'll be a couple of days, how does Europe, how does China prepare to think about what might happen in November?
Well, I've been banging the drum on this for 9 months to a year, I think. We've got the highest geopolitical risk in over 50 years already. So, the net of last night's debate is that it's negative for geopolitical risk, and it's negative for U.S. domestic political risk as well. Our foes already feel somewhat emboldened. That's a whole other conversation as to why, but they do. And allies now officially are probably going to be a little bit more disquieted.
I'm trying to avoid the 24-hour culture war cable TV talk, Terry, but I got to go to a single sentence of your brilliant note from last night. It's the first thing I read, folks, last night, coming off this debacle. You said of the President of the United States, sometimes over-prepped and was without humor, a sin for an Irish-American politician. This was no JFK last night, I get it, but the over-prepped, I think, is brilliant, Terry. His first answer, I was thunderstruck by the factoidness of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I heard that a bunch in the debate where, you could almost see you could almost hear the click, and, this is the spiel that works, and, with pollsters and fact gatherers, and this is my answer, kaboom. And of course that's a double-sided sword too, because whole Medicare gaffe happens when he forgets the line in the transition. So right. Biden's coin throughout his career has been affability and relatability, and neither showed up last night, and that's unfortunate for him.
Terry Haines, thank you so much. And for all of us at Bloomberg, thank you for your perspective across many conversations in the past 24 hours. Mr. Haines is with Pangaea. I know he'll be here on July 5th, and that is Neil Dutta. As all of you know, I thought he did a phenomenal job in 2023 of being optimistic. Neil Dutta of Renaissance, RedMac, I should say. Are you still optimistic about the American economic experiment?
I mean, my optimism is getting a little bit shaken because I think the Fed is, on the wrong side of the 8 ball here. Their rhetoric, I think, doesn't really match the tone of the incoming economic information that we're seeing. They're going around telling people that the economy is strong. Over the first 5 months of this year, real consumption is growing below 1%. New home sales, we just learned, are running at their lowest level since last November. Yeah. Pending home sales are at fresh record lows. And over the last 6 months, core capital goods orders and shipments are basically flat. And I think the reason that matters is because one of the things the hawks have been saying is that financial conditions are too easy. They're too easy, so the Fed can't cut. If financial conditions are so loose, why is it that things that you'd expect to respond to the sort of standard financial accelerator model, like housing, like business investment, they're flat on their back? Right. So either you're looking at the wrong financial stress variable. Maybe it's things like loan rates for private households more so than corporate credit spreads. Maybe it's the strong dollar. Maybe it's just high interest rates generally. More so than equity prices. That really is what we should be focusing on. Hi to Scarlett, by the way, Tom. I haven't talked to Scarlett, I feel like, in so long, so it's good to hear her.
Yeah, hey, it's great to hear her. She's like doing the 24-hour shift today, but the real issue is Dutta's with his kids in the afternoon. He's like, forget about Scarlett. Neil Dutta with Scarlett Fu. Good morning, all.
Neil, let me ask you about the core PC and just dig into it a little bit more, because it's slowing down. The gains are slowing down in large part because oil prices have come down. And I know we're talking about core versus non-core, but in any case, and declining goods prices. But services, which does include things like home insurance or auto insurance, that remains sticky. I got the bill for my home insurance. It was stunning. And yes, when I asked the broker to look into other policy premiums, couldn't find anything better. Exactly. So I was stuck with it.
Redux.
And we're not talking about 2.6% increase. We're talking about 20% increase.
Yeah, but your house price has gone up, so it's a wash.
Oh, listen to you.
Oh, Jon Ferro.
I don't think it's inflationary.
I had to cut the dogs back from Fancy Hills dog food to some, cheap Costco thing.
You guys are whining.
Because of the insurance. Continue, Scarlett.
So, Neil, talk a little bit more about the services inflation that we're seeing and the stickiness there, and whether we're not paying enough attention to it.
Well, I think we're paying too much attention to it, quite frankly, because this is being used as a rationale for sort of holding off on rate cuts. And frankly, I think what's interesting is that we can say why core services inflation has been strong, but I think it's more challenging to lay out a coherent rationale for why it will stay strong. One of the reasons why we look at core services is because of the labor market sensitivity. If you look at unit labor costs over the last year, they've been growing less than 1% at an annual rate. So where's the inflation coming from? You talk about insurance costs, and it's true that insurance costs have gone up, but it's also true that the underlying value of the asset you're insuring is not rising as rapidly as it once was, whether that be housing or, more importantly, autos, right? Auto adjacent services, things like motor vehicle insurance, maintenance and repair costs, those are ripe for disinflationary pressure because the value of the car is declining. I mean, if we look at wholesale auction prices for used vehicles, it looks like used car prices will continue deflating over the summer. We already know that new car prices are down about 1% since last year. So I think it's just important to kind of think about first principles. And what do we know? People are talking about how we're done with the disinflation in goods with the dollar breaking out to year-to-date highs. So how does that work? I mean, most of what we import are consumer goods. Right. So at any rate.
Well, Neil Dutta with us, and we're going to continue with Mr. Dutta. Gina Martin Adams with us as well. We are commercial free for you in this 8 o'clock hour. Lots going on. Futures stabilize up 18, then out to up 24. Now back to up 18. Mark that up 19 right now. S&P futures, NASDAQ up 0.5% as well. Neil Dutta, we just had an economist on talking about sub 2% real GDP for 6 months, Q1 and Q2. Do you buy into that the American economy is that moldy?
I mean, you could talk me into something like that. I mean, we had sub 1.5% growth in the first quarter. I do think that, it looks like Q2 is running about 2.5%. And, so you average that out, you're talking about around 2% for the first half of the year. I think what's important is that private domestic demand is clearly slowing. I mean, one of the reasons why there was a little bit of enthusiasm in the first quarter is because we had such a strong private domestic demand backdrop in Q1. But remember that a lot of that was premised on a 60 basis point increase in residential investment, which we know is not going to repeat in Q2 and probably not in Q3.
Yeah.
And so, again, I think, housing was a steady tailwind for GDP growth over the last several quarters. That's unlikely to be the case through the summer. So private domestic demand won't look as strong. And we had, we're having a big inventory restocking right now in the second quarter. But with orders still kind of sluggish, it's hard to see how long that inventory boost lasts. And that's going to ultimately weigh on manufacturing. So, yeah, I mean, I think you really have to have quite an imagination to say that we're running at 2.5%. I think, maybe 1.5%, that's possible for a quarter.
Wow.
But 2%, I think, is sort of where I'm kind of settling out.
To hear this from Neil Dutta is extraordinary. I mean, I get this from the Gloom crew, but Mr. Dutta is not the Gloom crew.
No, he's been the opposite of that. Yeah. I think about how last summer we got this unexpected lift from spending on going on vacation, Taylor Swift concerts. Is there anything on the horizon, Neil, in which you see Americans would be more willing to spend freely on?
Scarlett, I don't think about consumption like that. I mean, if it wasn't Taylor Swift, maybe you'd have more people at the Beyonce Renaissance tour. I mean, I think people go out and they want to spend money, based on what their real disposable incomes are doing. And fortunately, the last month was a good month for real disposable income. But generally speaking, what we know is that labor market dynamics are consistent with a cooling off of income growth. And that's going to weigh on consumer spending over time. The good news is that inflation should slow, so that should kind of keep real incomes on a steady here. And that's why I'm not really lighting my hair on fire over recession risk. What I'm talking about really is just a recalibration of monetary policy. No one's talking about a wholesale easing. I don't think the economy requires that. But the Fed does have a role to play. They have to play along here. I mean, they can't just keep saying, the economy's strong, we don't have to do anything when evidence is showing something else. So I think they just need to kind of set their rhetoric to the incoming data, and we'll be okay.
Neil Dutta, thank you so much with Renmac. Just can't say enough about his work here. Clearly more cautious than what we saw last year as well. The real world, folks, of Bloomberg surveillance is 20 people. Now 23. We've got 3 interns helping us out. Piecing the show together depends, what time. And of course, with the shock of the debate, literally during the debate, our team with the leadership of Sparta was blowing up the show. And the real world, folks, is I sit on a leather couch in my living room, and Vet Bill's sitting there on my lap, and, I'm hanging out with a cell phone. And the first email I said was, get Henrietta. And there is only one Henrietta. She has the sharpest note, with Terry Haines. Henrietta Treyz joining us from Veda Partners. It will be ugly. It must be fast. And in your list of people to save the day, Henrietta Treyz, you have one of my favorite people, the governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, the former Secretary of Commerce. How can Gina Raimondo or others save the day for the Democratic Party?
Well, thank you for that very generous intro, Tom. I appreciate it. I was really kind of surprised last night as I was speaking with Democratic staff throughout the evening. Gina Raimondo's name came up in every single conversation repeatedly, whether that was campaign operatives sort of in the think tanks, whether that was folks on the Hill, people who've worked on campaigns. She was perpetually there. And I think it speaks to exactly what you get at. Commerce Secretary Raimondo is highly competent. She has been tasked with probably the largest job in the Biden administration this year, which is rolling out the combination of the CHIPS bill and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, not all at the same time, but through building out, a 200-person team at Commerce to get all this across the country. And that is no small task. That's what she's undertaken. And I think there's a lot of respect for her within the Democratic Party as maybe like a slightly under the radar possibility.
You are expert at the machinery. If the president says, I'm going to not resign, let's be clear on that, folks, but just step aside, who decides who becomes their candidate?
I think the person that everyone should be watching right now is House Representative Jim Clyburn. I mean, he is the one who orchestrated the win for Biden in South Carolina. If y'all remember that primary schedule, I mean, Biden was down and out for a while. Bernie Sanders was the front runner in all the betting markets for a while. And Joe Biden really needed Jim Clyburn in South Carolina to pull that out for him. And one of the contingencies was that Kamala Harris needed to be the vice president. He plays kingmaker in the party, and I would encourage folks to watch him most closely in the hours ahead.
That is super valuable to keep an eye on, Clyburn. Investors and companies know Gina Raimondo because of her role in all that important legislation that affects economies, affects the markets, but voters don't. Voters know Kamala Harris. So if something happens and Biden steps aside, wouldn't Kamala Harris be kind of the default presidential candidate?
Absolutely, no question. And I appreciate you mentioning that because I think a lot of the street washes over her and sort of immediately steps into a Gavin Newsom or a Gretchen Whitmer type candidate. And I think that's a mistake. Kamala Harris is the sitting vice president. She is the highest ranking female official in American history. She is highly competent herself and has served as a United States Senator, Attorney General in California. There's no reason to skip over her. And I think it would be a massive affront to a huge population of the American public and the Democratic voting base if they were to supersede her sort of unceremoniously. This is going to be, at this point, a party line decision. The primary season is over. So for the most part, Democratic voters and people who are in the individual states that participate in primaries and caucuses are not going to have a say now. This is a party decision. It's my opinion that Kamala has to be the front runner. She is the front runner behind Biden should he step down. And it would be incumbent upon her to decide whether or not she wanted to actively bow out to cede room to someone else if that's a decision she wants to make. I think she's next in line, and it would be, as I said, incumbent upon her to say, you know what, I'm going to step aside with the entirety of the ticket. If Biden's out, I'm out, and sort of clear the way for the other four people I listed in my note this morning.
So the punditry is clear in terms of calling yesterday's debate a disaster for President Biden. Is the Democratic Party united in understanding the debacle that was the debate? Are they united that something needs to be done?
I mean, I would say my cell phone was a death march of Democrats last night. And the kindest thing I could say about that is that they were united in that assessment. I don't think you can talk to any Democrat right now who would tell you that last night went well, or that the biggest problem with Biden's age is not, the age itself. It's not the number. It's the fact that Donald Trump lied, 30 plus times repeatedly on every issue from January 6th to abortion. And because of Biden's age, he could not combat those lies in real time. That's the problem.
Okay, so Henry, what's the timeline here to Scarlett's good question? I mean, my answer is, in talking to Margaret Brennan with CBS, there's a timeline which is collegial. Oh, Chicago. Oh, wow, August will come back from summer. The third week of September. Baloney. What's the Henrietta Treyz timeline for Friday afternoon, Saturday, the Sunday talk shows, and you get the Mondays? Anybody talking a shorter timeline, Henrietta Treyz?
Yes, absolutely. One of my favorite people in the world, Kevin Casey, well, shout out, my mentor when I was on the Ways and Means Committee, working with him on the Ways and Means Committee. The first thing to think about is that Democrats feel like they have a little bit of breathing room there is a moment here where Trump versus the United States is going to be decided by the Supreme Court. We're going to find out if the claims of presidential immunity are going to hold or not. That could come as early as today, within the next couple hours. That is something that immediately gives Democrats a sense of a little bit of breathing room. On July 11th, Donald Trump is going to be sentenced for the 34th felony guilty counts that he received in the hush money trial about election interference with a porn star in 2016. Then you'll have the announcement of Donald Trump's running mate, the vice president. So there's going to be other pieces taking up oxygen for the next couple of days that Democrats are really hoping will clear some of the air and give them room to sort of breathe and work behind the scenes. I don't expect a solution or a conclusion to the will he or won't he step aside question anytime soon.
Henrietta, let me get this in because we're going to go to Rick Davis on this in a moment, folks. Stay with us through the half hour. This is going to be special. But I mean, have we ever really tested the 25th Amendment before on succession and disability of a president?
Not really. And it's interesting you bring that up. I think there's a lot of confusion about this on the street. I've been marketing the last couple of weeks, and I spent a lot of time walking through how, it's actually not a constitutional crisis to have the vice president step in and take place for the president. That is literally what the Constitution instructs us to do. Then you go to the Speaker of the House and so on and so forth. So it's an issue of relaying and sort of socializing the American public to sort of what happens next. The good news for Democrats here is that 66% of the population already wants somebody other than Biden and somebody other than Trump to be on the ticket. So if it's going to happen, this is oddly enough kind of the best way. It's been speculated about all year. You can see it from the predictive markets. There has been at least 20% odds that Biden would not be the nominee. I think that's much higher this morning. I haven't checked, but I assume it's about 40%. And that is going to give you a baseline to start with on these sort of otherwise wildly extreme circumstances that are pretty normalized this year. A lot of the American public is socialized to the fact that this might happen. Certainly the investment community is.
Henrietta, just fabulous. Thank you so much. Henrietta Treyz with us with Veda Partners. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.